Science fiction, double feature, Dr. X will be...
There's this concept in queer theory of queer time. It's the idea that because time is so wrapped up in the heteronormative life steps of a traditional path, meeting someone nice, getting married, having kids, moving into the suburbs, etc., that individuals whose lives deviate from that path, which most queer people do, actually experience time differently. A lot of it also has to do with queer representations in the media. Historically, most queer people have been represented as either perpetrators or victims of violence. Those representations are historically lonely and unfulfilled. In his book, Queer Temporalities in Gay Male Representation, Dustin Bradley Goltz has this to say.
The gay male, both young and old, are constructed as the victims of time and future, yet these tragic rituals of gay aging are determined by the exclusionary logics of heteronormative temporalities, victims to a limited conception of straight time.
So, if the system by which time and aging are experienced is heteronormative and restrictive, what's the alternative?
Masterpiece, the Rocky Horror Picture Show, is probably the best and most literal exploration of queer temporality ever put onto film. The film opens on a fantastic caricature of heterosexual cultural signifiers. Brad immediately proposes to Janet after being impressed by her demonstration of competitive femininity in catching the bouquet of flowers thrown at the wedding they are attending. They decide to go meet up with a scientist whose class they had met in, and they experience a flat tire, leaving them stranded. There, they enter Dr. Frankenfurter's mansion, which is an explicitly queer environment. Brad and Janet are, at first, horrified by the mansion. Janet is terrified, turning to Brad for comfort, and Brad, the hyper-masculine straight man, continuously refuses to adapt to the oddities of the people they are encountering, instead attempting to use charm and confidence to get a phone which will allow them to escape the manor as fast as possible. It's only when Brad and Janet are stripped of their nice, appropriate clothes, symbolic of their undertaking of a traditional conservative path, that their attitude towards the people in the manor change. Once stripped of their clothes, they are free to open up to different perspectives. Janet begins to find Frankenfurter charming. Brad softens up and stops asking to get the phone. They even watched confused but seemingly interested as Frankenfurter creates Rocky, a gay Frankenstein's monster explicitly created for sex, and don't even protest much when Frankenfurter commits murder. Their original clothes never return, and even in their more open, naked state, their own innocence and vulnerability is mocked by Dr. Frankenfurter, whose gender-bending nature becomes attractive to both Brad and Janet. Dr. Frankenfurter, meanwhile, far from being oppressed by the clothing he adorns, is liberated. He is a vampire, a woman, and a scientist. He can become Brad, then Janet. In a lot of ways, Dr. Frankenfurter embodies the very unique power of drag. A power that is the focus of the 1990 documentary Paris is Burning, about the gay ballroom scene in Harlem around the 1980s. The balls were essentially competition with numerous categories, and drag queen Dorian Corey had this to say about a category named Executive Realness.
In real life, you can't get a job as an executive unless you have the educational background and the opportunity. Now, the fact that you are not an executive is merely because of the social standing of life. That is just pure thing. Black people have a hard time getting anywhere. And those that do are usually straight. In a ballroom, you can be anything you want. You're not really an executive, but you're looking like an executive. And therefore, you're showing the straight world that I can be an executive. If I had the opportunity, I could be one, because I can look like one. And that is like a fulfillment. Your peers, your friends are telling you, oh, you'd make a wonderful executive.
The category allowed for some of the most marginalized groups of people to feel empowered, to embody for a moment that which is always denied to them. Dr. Frankenfurter pushes this to the extreme. His realness is convincing enough to fool everyone, allowing him to finally indulge in pleasures that would be deemed inadmissible in other spaces. Here, all are pushed to explore and indulge in every single desire, to experience hedonistic pleasure above all else. It's wonderful, bizarre, beautiful, but also unstable and toxic. Everyone becomes trapped in this mindset, unable to escape it, and once the place crumbles, they're left fundamentally changed, confused, hunting for meaning.
And crawling on the planet's face, some insects called the human race, lost in time and lost in space and meaning.
The Rocky Horror Picture Show is a story about the beauty of hell. It's a story that dares us to throw away our conservative moral ideologies in order to accept a morality of compassion for others above all else, regardless of situation. It's a story that provokes empathy. In her essay, Drag Queens and Gender Identity, published in 2016 in the Journal of Gender Studies, author Caitlin Greaf has this to say about the claim that drag queens are, quote, hyperfeminine.
By believing that drag queens are hyperfeminine, individuals are overlooking crucial identity information, not only when it comes to drag identity, but also gender identity. Drag identity consists of more than wearing big wigs, makeup, and feminine clothing. Instead of being hyperfeminine, drag queens take the pre-existing social image of a woman in order to create and perform who their drag persona is.
The very interesting idea that underlays this quote is that it assumes a relationship between fashion, identity, and time. Drag is a performance that seeks to mirror, embody, and impersonate gender signifiers while also challenging them in very interesting ways. Dr. Frankenfurter is actually a really interesting example of that. He refers to himself as transsexual but uses male pronouns and continues to switch between both male and female gender signifiers. His drag allows him to move fluently between identities. It allows him to become whatever he would like to become, to really encapsulate that which he imitates. This looking to the past might help one find a community or a space or feel as though their identity matters. And that's exactly what San Junipero, the 4th episode of Season 3 of Black Mirror, tries to do in a genuinely very interesting and unique way.
The episode is deliberately jarring, fooling the audience into believing its setting, the 80s, without revealing the secret. San Junipero is a construction. The setting is a future that has the technology to digitally preserve one's consciousness at the time and place of their choosing. The women of San Junipero choose the 80s. They choose a type of style, choose their own presentation, and slowly allow themselves to fall for one another. Yorkie's story is a tragic one. She was paralyzed at 21 after a car crash following her parents reacting poorly to her coming out. For her entire life, she's trapped until San Junipero. There, she's young, she can walk, and she's finally free to explore her sexuality. This beautified past, The 80s in a shiny, pretty kaleidoscope lens is what Yorkie needed in order to finally age. Kelly's background is quite different. She had a life before San Junipero, and by all accounts a good one, which ended with her daughter, then husband, passing away without being uploaded into San Junipero. This space to her feels like she is somehow disrespecting people she loved. By the end, though, she makes her peace. She decides that this heaven, this space, is allowed to contain her. She gives herself permission to love again, and to explore part of her sexuality that she may never have had the chance to explore otherwise. Much like drag queens borrow from past eras to create their personas, San Junipero recreates the past while perfecting it, smoothing it out. What would the 80s look like if everyone was young and beautiful and fashionable and very, very open-minded? What would Yorkie's life be like if her family was accepting? There's a reason she's attached to that specific time. She feels connected to it in a very intense, genuine way. This is where she left off. It's important to her to borrow from the past in order to create a better, less heartbreaking timeline. In his essay, Introducing Queer Theory into the Undergraduate Classroom, Abstractions and Practical Application, author Frederick L. Greene writes, "Our identity, how we recognize ourselves and are recognized by others, is a complex construction, an articulation of historical demands on an already discursively mapped body. The most deeply experienced and personal sense of individuality and interiority is always already social."
So what does it mean? Well, it means that for a minority group that can, by design, be very invisible, the use of codes, fashion, and signifiers becomes essential to survival. One might try to pass as straight, for example, in order to avoid violence. Or one might use codes that explicitly state their sexuality or overtly projects queerness in order either to find community or even expose to others that they might be someone who is safe to talk to. These are mechanisms born out of necessity. These signifiers are necessary to the formation of identity and well-being and to connecting with an overarching community that can be found in queer-friendly spaces that allow this type of development to occur. Whether it's through hedonistic pleasures or sweet reimaginings, the journey towards self-discovery is always beautiful.
Michael Rennie was ill the day the earth stood still, but he told us where we stand. And Flash Gordon was there in silver underwear. Claude Rains was the invisible man. Then something went wrong for Faye Ray